Epoch, Dawn of Heroes, by the Emerald Coast Archer. Synopsis. In the dawning of a new era, humanity strives to understand its destiny while struggling to recall its past. Tales of heroes, gods, and monsters fill volumes of books with enough ink to turn the world's oceans black. Yet they are dismissed as fantasy. Now new heroes rise to discover the truth of humanity's history and to face the coming apocalypse. One soldier's fate begins a new era where all humanity will learn that the tales of heroes, gods, and monsters weren't just stories after all, and perhaps we should have headed them more closely. Chapter 1. Welcome home. Jack prayed silently for the people in the city as the dark silhouette of Mirage loomed in the distance, illuminated by the dim, pale moonlight streaming down from above and reflecting off the craggy, dusty, Mars-like terrain. The only noises filling the air was the far-off howling of a few dogs and the quiet chatter from the comms as the captain got the orders. A moment later, the comms went quiet as the captain stood and looked to his squad. Colonel Barrett says move in. The target's a small airport on the north edge of the city. We move, in, secure it, and wait for the birds. I want 2 teams. Insert from the east and west via the main highway using the technicals. The guns are firing on the complexes south of us to cut off the T-man reinforcements. Weapons check and move out in 5. Jack nodded along with the rest of the detachment as everyone began to make their way towards the 2 old sand-blasted trucks they'd acquired from a few hostiles. He leaned up against the passenger door of the old dingy truck with its sun-faded Merlot paint. He looked over towards the side view mirror sticking off the door and crouched down, hunching his back. Jack looked into the side view mirror and barely recognized the man that looked back at him now. He was in his mid-30s, tiny crow's feet just beginning to form around the corners of his blue eyes, making him look older than he was. Jack reached up and ran a hand through his long, unkempt, wavy, soft brown hair, highlighted with rogue grey strands that stuck out here and there. It parted to the right and hung down about his ears after months of being behind enemy lines. A far cry from the high and tight he'd grown accustomed to during his military service. His hand moved down, scratching through the mat of thick, coarse, brown facial hair that was streaked with grey. His beard had grown in thick over his deployment behind enemy lines. Jack groaned as he stood up straight again and arched his back to stretch, letting out another groan. He was fairly tall, a little over 6 feet by a couple of inches. All the time sleeping on the ground had left a near-constant ache in his back. The long hours in the sun hard darkened his soft white skin to a deep tan. The sun and sandblasting from the desert had thickened his hide, almost turning his skin to leather, creasing his face with a few light wrinkles. The price of the life a soldier led, that and the risk of death and injury, but Jack was okay with that. It was a soldier's life, and the life kept him fit. His broad shoulders, square jaw, and intense bright blue eyes gave him a rugged sort of attractiveness. This is one of the most kinetic targets we've hit, and these bastards like using civvies as shields. Gentlemen, so check your targets and you'll watch your 6. De oppresso liber, Jack said in his light Texan drawl as he climbed into the back of the truck and began checking over the Marduce mounted on it. You too, Master Sergeant, and copy that, filled the air from the rest of the men. Hey, Master Sergeant. Jack looked over to see CPT Gibson approaching. Gibson's sandy blonde hair was pushed out. From under the turban he wore wrapped around his head, and his long, thin, wiry beard gave him away as a foreigner. His long sideburns, thick mustache, and scraggly beard gave him the appearance of a Civil War soldier, but his style of dress made him look like the T-man, the same thing they all wore. Gibson looked up to Jack as he approached, his eyes even with the bridge of Jack's nose putting him about an inch shorter. His youthful appearance belied the fact that he'd more than earned his stripes over the deployment. Gibson's wore the same permanent grin he always had, the corners of his mouth wrinkled slightly and showing his dimples, further adding to his youthful appearance. Gibson's keen green eyes met Jack's. It'll be a shame to see you go, said Gibson. I'm going to hate having to replace you, but it's been an honor serving with you, Master Sergeant. I just wanted to wish you good luck with retirement, he said as he held out his hand. When Jack got assigned to this detachment, he was only first sergeant around Gibson's age, and it was under the command of his longtime friend, Captain Barrett, the same Colonel Barrett now giving the squad orders. He'd been promoted 2 years ago or so, and since then, Jack's detachment had changed from one captain to the next. Jack smiled and took Gibson's offered hand, giving him a firm shake as he patted his captain on the shoulder. "You too, Captain. Don't let these goobs push you around. They do, and you tell 'em I'll be back to. Kick their asses," Jack said with a light laugh. He turned to go before hesitating. "Oh, the Colonel said for you to watch your ass. He said he's counting on you to keep his little girl out of trouble while she's at college. I don't envy you there, sir. I'd rather stay here and fight the T-Man than deal with a moody Colonel's daughter going off to college. You sure you don't want to stay and fight?" "Might be easier," added the captain with a chuckle. Jack laughed. "Yeah, well, just trading one war zone for another, right? Besides, she's my daughter. Somebody's got to keep that girl on the straight and narrow and beat those boys off with a stick." Gibson moved to the lead vehicle, and the rest of the squad loaded up into the sand-blasted old pickup trucks repurposed into assault vehicles. The 2 trucks set out, kicking up moon dust as they drove across the sandy, scrub-lined roads that led to Mirage. Jack watched as the lead vehicle broke off to the east and disappeared steadily into the darkness before looking towards the city. In the darkness, it was hard to see anything. Sharp whistling suddenly broke the night, followed by an explosion, then a thunderous boom in the distance. The siege began, and chaos broke out as Jack's covert unit sped towards the city along the deserted road. Dressed as Taliban soldiers and driving in one of their trucks made it easy to get inside. The city looked post-apocalyptic, especially bathed in the light of explosions, flares and fires, like something from Mad Max or Escape from LA. The truck turned a corner towards the LZ. Suddenly, Jack was flying through the air as a nearby pile of debris exploded. The truck was on its side smoking, and Jack's ears were ringing so loud he couldn't hear a thing. The front of the truck had been nearly ripped off, and flames were shooting up through the cab, engulfing 2 of his brothers. Jack could see 2 other men laying on the ground about 10 feet from the truck. One had blood pooling around his head, and his neck was at an odd angle from where he was laying against the dull, khaki-colored stone wall he'd obviously hit, smeared with blood and gore like the time he'd accidentally hit a deer with his truck on the interstate. The other soldier was rolling from side to side, blood covering his face. Jack tried to stand, but his leg gave out, and he crumpled to the ground as a red-hot pain shot through his body from his right hip. He clawed at the loose dirt, dragging himself towards the wreck of the truck to try and help his brothers as his vision tunneled and everything went black. Jack took heavy breaths, struggling with each step as the muscles in his hip refused to react and support his weight, forcing him to lean on the cold, collapsible cane he gripped tightly in his right hand. The groceries tucked into the plastic bag, held tightly in his left hand, shifted from side to side, throwing off each step just a bit further and making him struggle a bit more. Beads of sweat poured down his brow and soaked into the collar of his t-shirt. His legs and thighs ached even after traveling such a short distance from his apartment to the corner store just to grab a few things. 6 months ago, he was healthy and strong, and even though he was in hell, he had his brothers. He had respect. He was so close to retirement, too. Now he didn't even respect himself, and here he was back at home, the place he'd fought to get to. And he felt more alone now than at any point over in the sandbox. Hell, he could barely make it out the front door and down to the Dollar General for smokes and beers. Of course, everyone said how very brave he was, and that a medical discharge was nothing to be ashamed of. Still, he was ashamed. His hip hurt all the time, as did most of his right leg. He could still feel people staring at him with a look of, what's wrong with him? What happened to him? Or even worse, that poor guy. But at least he was home, he guessed. I can't believe how shitty this neighborhood's become since I got deployed last time. His mind drifted back to his arrival home from the military hospital 4 days ago. He'd stepped off the plane and had to be assisted up the ramp by a flight attendant up. Waiting. For him was one of those airport shuttle carts. So he made short talk with the driver and thanked him for welcoming him home from Afghanistan as they whizzed through the airport, passing by other soldiers lugging their bags while he sat on an electrical cart. He'd been dreading his return home. He figured nobody would be waiting for him since his father had passed away just before he got deployed. He knew it was coming because his mother had passed only a few years before. It was sweet in a way, but he missed his folks. Thankfully, waiting for him at the end of the terminal was Cassandra, his goddaughter. She was 18 now and a freshman in college at AANDM. She was taller than he remembered, damn near 6 feet now. She was slender but had an athletic build and a golden tan from her years spent bouncing between various sports including volleyball, soccer, softball, karate, taekwondo, and competitive cheerleading. Cassie was dressed in a black leather jacket, a pink t-shirt, jeans, and old combat boots. Her short, dark bob bounced, and her steel-grey eyes sparkled brightly as she charged Jack and nearly took him off my feet with a tackle as she took him into a hug. "Hey, Uncle Jack, welcome home. I brought you a present," she said as he held out a large cigar, wrapped in cellophane that had bold Cyrillic writing emblazoned across it. "The doctor wouldn't let me give it to you in the hospital. Oh, and I brought you your Jeep, too. So, you can drive it home," she said as she reached into her right jacket pocket and produced a ring of keys, with a Hard Rock Berlin keychain dangling from it, and handed them to him. Jack began to limp his way towards the baggage claim area with Cassandra moving beside him, while keeping a careful eye on him and their surroundings as he pocketed the keys. "You sure you don't need some help?" asked Cassie, with a concerned look on her face as she reached out to take his arm. Jack pulled away and shot her a disapproving look mixed with a smug smile. "You do and I'll deck ya," he said with a laugh and a smile. Cassie grinned and chuckled. "Yeah, right. I'd lay your ass out in 3 seconds flat, old man. Oh, let me tell you about this guy." Jack went wide-eyed a bit at the sudden segue in the conversation and what it had to do with her kicking his ass. Classic Cassie, but she was right. She probably could have laid him out in seconds in his pitiful condition. He sighed and listened as they walked, limping along beside her as she spoke. "So I was trying to join this sorority, right? The Delta Kappas. Anyways, so they had this big Greek mixer for all the frats and sororities to get together at this bar." Jack shot her another disapproving look. "Relax, they still carded and I didn't drink anything, though I could have. I mean the security was pitiful, and a couple of the bartenders and the security guards were total creepers." Jack sighed but grinned and continued to listen as the baggage claim came into view. Sadly, it wasn't the one for his plane. That was further away. "But I decided to go out on the dance floor and start dancing with some of my girlfriends and stuff, when this guy came up and started trying to grind on me. I mean, he wasn't that bad looking, but just no. So I tried to ignore him and ghost him, hoping he'd take the message. But he didn't. The jerk kept grinding up on me and stuff, and it was totally gross." Jack smiled, still the innocent Cassie, thank God. But how long could that last, he wondered. He just wouldn't stop, though. So finally, I just turned around and full-on decked his ass, surprised him, and landed it square in his jaw on the sweet spot, just like you told me. "Haha, you should have seen it. I swear his head and shoulders hit the ground before his feet did." Jack went wide-eyed again, but this time cracked a thin, approving grin, which he tried his best to conceal. He'd first shown her a few moves in some of the CQC training he'd picked up back when she was in middle school, and a few girls had begun picking on her for not having a mum. She'd taken to it like a fish to water. After that, he'd trained her for several years through high school, and she'd even competed in Taekwondo and won first every year she competed in the local Austin tournament they held in the fall. But a hit that hard surprised even him. He'd seen only a few hits that hard from the sounds of it, even in his life, but for a teenage girl to level a guy near her age like that was pretty impressive. "Yeah, right," she said, steel eyes shining and full lips stretched into a wide smile. "He was spitting out teeth, and I guess I ended up breaking his jaw. Dumbass has to have it wired shut now." "Cassie!" Jack shot her a disapproving glare. "What? He deserved it. I mean, maybe. That sounds a little overkill. What did I teach you about self-control and appropriate escalation of force?" Cassie sighed and rolled her eyes as she stuck her hands in her back pockets, jutting out her chest. slightly and making his gaze shift on instinct to straight ahead. I know, she said with a sigh and a frown before crossing her arms over her chest. I honestly didn't mean to do all that. I don't know, I just kinda let him have it and didn't hold back. It's not my fault he had a glass jaw, she replied. Jack nodded. Still, proud of you for sticking up for yourself. But what is it with you and knocking out the teeth of boys that like you, huh? What was the poor kid's name? You kissed him and… Okay, shut up. That was when I was 6 and I didn't know what anything was about, all right. And he'd already lost one of his front teeth, okay, and it came back when he got his adult teeth. Cassie fell silent for a moment as Jack grinned sideways at her while she blushed. She always hated it when he teased her about that. And his name was Jeremy, she added matter-of-factly. Right, I remember having to come get you from after-school care because your dad was on deployment, and the lady there having to explain to me that you'd punched out a boy's teeth for liking you after you kissed him. Jack said with a smile and a laugh, it was only one tooth. And like I said, I was 6, okay. Let it die, she said with a sigh. Jack smiled. Nope, never. I'll be giving you shit about that on your wedding day. That is assuming. You can find yourself a husband since you keep knocking out boys' teeth every time one tries to make a pass at you. I do not. Not every time, just a couple. And yeah, I may have punched a few others for moving too fast or whatever, or for cheating on me, but they deserved it. And none of those other ones lost any teeth. So drop it. Cassie was beginning to get a bit heated, and Jack could see it, but it was still fun to tease her. In actuality, he was really her godfather, but she was always much more like a niece or daughter to him. Back when he first met Steve, he'd been assigned under him and was surprised to learn that the captain was a single dad and an officer in the military. Back then, Steve's grandparents had helped with Cassie, but after working with him for a few deployments and getting to know the family when they were watching football, cooking out, shooting at the range, hunting or whatever, they'd all grown close. Cassie's grandparents had passed a few years after that, and she'd clung to him for comfort. Since then, they'd been close. What surprised him at first was that Cassie was so little and had no mum. Steve hardly ever. He mentioned her mother, just that they'd met while he was on deployment as a lieutenant, had a brief thing, and 9 months later he had a daughter. In the more than a decade he'd known Steve, he'd only mentioned her in passing a handful of times, but Jack could tell the look of a guy that lost a woman he loved. Hell, he knew that feeling. It was just something you didn't talk about generally. They neared the baggage claim conveyor belt for his plane, but it wasn't so much as moving yet. Jack sighed and groaned, but stood patiently as he waited, hip throbbing and screaming the entire time. He reached into his pocket, producing a small pill bottle of 200 milligrams painkillers before downing 2 of them. He pocketed the bottle and sighed. Cassie looked over. You sure you're okay? Yeah, I'm fine, said Jack as he rubbed at his hip gently with his hand, but you can drive. He added as he reached into his pocket, produced the keys she'd given him and tossed them to her. She caught them deftly and nodded before pocketing the keys once more as she gave him a concerned look. He hated it. After several moments in silence, the conveyor belt began to turn, and bags began to pop out one by one. Thankfully, Jack's was one of the first out. I got it, said Cassie as she moved over to the side, cutting him off before waiting as the large, green canvas bag slowly grew closer. As it neared her, she reached down, grasping it firmly by one of the straps and lifting it up before shouldering it. Damn, she was strong. Looks like all those sports really had paid off. Cassie waddled along next to him, carrying the bag as he limped beside her, and they made their way out of the baggage claim area and onto the wet street as rain trickled down steadily from overhead. Jack and Cassie waited in mostly silence until a shuttle van arrived to take them to the parking garage where Cassie had parked. They made their way to his old orange ragtop Jeep, and Cassie loaded his bag into the back as he climbed into the side with a bit of a struggle before Cassie climbed in and cranked the older model vehicle up before backing out and beginning to make their way back towards his apartment. As they drove, Cassie began to talk his ear off, telling Jack all about her dorm room, what classes she was taking, and everything else going on in her life, while Jack puffed on one of his favorite Russian cigars. Most of what she said was a blur. It kept his mind off his troubles, But even with her there, Jack felt alone. She'd always been the closest thing he had to a daughter, but he felt disconnected from everything now. They finished up the night with pizza and wings from Crago's Pizza and watched Jack's favorite movie, Enter the Dragon, before he wished Cassie a good night as he hobbled along with her to her car before watching her drive off. Then he headed back to his apartment to take a shower and be alone. He stepped back inside his home and looked about the apartment. It was decently enough sized for what he paid. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen and bar top directly adjacent to a small area where his dining room table was. A small living room are directly across from that. A short hallway leading down to the 2 bedrooms across from one another, and the bathroom at the end of the hallway between the 2 bedrooms. The apartment was moderately furnished, a 42-inch flat-screen TV, small sound system, a coffee table he got at a yard sale, the couch he'd inherited from his parents, a few shadow boxes containing various medals, sports memorabilia he'd collected, a few framed posters of John Wayne, Bruce Lee, and Clint Eastwood, his collection of DVDs containing the several key titles of the aforementioned movie stars, along with the complete works of The MASH, The Dukes of Hazzard, and several of his other favorite titles among film and television. Is this what I fought for? He thought before his mind was pulled back to reality. 2 people were arguing outside. It was probably just the couple across the alley, and he'd seen them at it before the times he'd been back from deployment. So he tried to ignore it. Jack turned the shower on just as he heard a scream. Immediately he rushed to the window and wrestled it open. On the other side of the window, a brunette, somewhere in her 30s, dressed in a smart blue coat, white blouse and jeans, tugged frantically at her purse. "Let go of me, arsehole," she screamed. A man dressed in a black hoodie with a small skull imprinted on the front and 0 written over it, along with a pair of tattered jeans, grasped the strap of her purse tightly and struggled to snatch it away. She reached up and clawed at his face, leaving deep, oozing gashes across his right cheek, forcing him to cry out in anguish. "Ah, no mames puta," he shouted as he grasped one of her wrists with a hand as his other, wrenched at the strap on the purse to keep her from striking him with it. "Are you dame cabron?" he shouted frantically to someone out of view. It was then Jack noticed another guy running up on her from behind. He must have been hiding somewhere because Jack couldn't see him before from his narrow view through the window. He was wearing a green and white leather jacket and blue jeans with a matching green ball cap pulled low so he couldn't make out anything else. "Let go of the purse, crazy bitch," he shouted as he came up behind her. Jack was already scrambling for his phone, which he'd left on the coffee table in his tiny apartment living room, along with something else he had stashed away. In his haste, he fell and swore as he hit the stained light beige carpeted floor before pushing himself up, snatching his phone from the tabletop and pulling his .45 pistol from its magnetic holster under the table. In an instant, he was dialing 911 and hobbling his way back into the bathroom. "911, what's your emergency?" came a female voice from the other end of the line. The woman's frantic cries for help continued from outside, along with a mix of swearing from the 2 men. "Yes, I'd like to report a crime in progress. There's 2 guys robbing a girl outside my apartment. I'm at La Hacienda Estates. I've got my gun, and I'm going to stop them. My name is Master Sergeant Jackson Sinclair Majors." "You'll better hurry the fuck up," Jack said flatly before hanging up the phone. "Hey, shitheads, leave her alone," he shouted as he rounded the corner. The barrel of his gun came up as he leveled it towards Hoodie and squeezed the trigger. The report of gunfire filled the bathroom, echoing off the teal-tiled floor, partially deafening Jack as the stink of nitrocellulose filled the air. Jack's round caught him high and to the right, clipping his shoulder and spinning him to the ground out of view. Jacket already had his gun out, a sleek black 9mm, and he was quickly raising it and leveling it towards the window. All hell broke loose as he pulled the trigger over and over, peppering the brick wall around the window and the bathroom, filling the air with dust as he let loose the chaotic barrage. Jack dropped to the floor a split second before the bathroom mirror behind him shattered, and as he did, a short, animal-like yelp filled the air outside as he emptied the magazine. Everything went quiet again, except for a few muffled voices outside the window. Jack stood and looked out, leaning awkwardly over the toilet. He could see both men retreating down the alley. Hoodie was leaving a trail of crimson droplets on the ground as he gripped his right shoulder tightly with his left hand while Jacket held him around the waist and helped him run. Both men rounded the corner and disappeared out of view quickly. A second or two later, the slamming of car doors and the screech of tires could be heard. Jack looked about and called out for the woman to see if she was all right. "Hey, lady! Lady, you okay?" Jack shouted, but there was no response. He leaned out a bit further, nearly slipping on the toilet and making his hips scream at him. There she was, laid out beside the long line of dumpsters that butted up against the wall, blood pooling around her on the ground as she stared blankly at the opposing wall of the alley. Jack was used to death. He'd seen plenty of his men die in the IED that got him medically, discharged, and more even before that. But this was different. She was home. She should have been safe. This shouldn't have happened. She didn't sign up to give her life. Of course, Jack had to go through the whole rigmarole when the police arrived. Hours of questions and a night down at the local precinct, along with many follow-up questions over the next several days. He'd seen her obituary in the paper a day or two later, along with an article about it on page 2. Her name was Jenny Tillinghast. She was an elementary school teacher, had a fiancé, and was only 4 months from getting married. She was only 28. Her parents and fiancé had called to talk to Jack, but the police had told him to wait to speak with anyone, and with as broken up as he was over it, he didn't want to hear their teary-eyed thank yous. He didn't deserve it. He'd failed them, he'd failed her, he'd failed himself, and he failed to uphold the oath he took, just like he'd failed to save his brothers that died. Now, I gotta appear in court to testify Monday. I hope that piece of shit gets the chair, and I hope they catch that guy in the jacket and do the same to him. Jack was deep in thought as he neared his apartment building. The police tape had been taken, down and the street scrubbed, but he could still hear that girl's cries for help, echoing out from his subconscious. Damn it, that poor girl. I still can't believe they shot her over a purse and a few stupid bucks. This ain't the Austin I knew growing up. This ain't the Austin I love. What the fuck is wrong with this world? The screech of tires on the pavement behind him broke his train of thought and snapped Jack from his moment of self-loathing and reflection, long enough for him to look back. A dark green SUV fish-tailed slightly as it completed the quick turn, making the rear shocks groan. "Slow down, man. Kids live around here. You ain't drag racing or four-wheeling," Jack shouted, angrily. Don't I know that guy? Jack wondered as he looked at the driver of the vehicle. A second later, he realized who it was. It was Jacket. That was when he noticed both windows on. The passenger side rolled down, and 2 men leaned out. Jacket had his hat pulled low like before, and the other 2 had hats on with their hoodies pulled up over them, and each had a pair of sunglasses on. He'd never seen the other 2 before, but he knew the driver by that ugly green and white leather jacket and his matching hat. Cold metal flashed in the sun as they raised their guns. Jack knew just how screwed he was right away. The one in the passenger seat leveled a MAC-10 out the window as the one in the back hoisted up a sawed-off Mossberg 500 with a pistol grip in one hand. Jack just prayed both of them had Jacket's aim, that the one with the SMG chewed through his ammo before he hit him, and that the idiot with the shotgun broke his damn wrist when he pulled the trigger. That was a last-ditch prayer, though. With them coming up on him fast and such a short distance between himself and them, Jack barely had time to react at all. His atrophied hip and right leg were useless. They reduced his reaction time. Even then, they were coming up on him so fast he only had time to get out 2 short words before all hell broke. He dropped the groceries and turned to the side to push a few nearby pedestrians out of the line of fire. "Get down," was what he said, but all that went through his mind as he found himself starring. Down those 3 barrels was, "Oh shit." "Bienvenidos culo," cried the one with the MAC-10 as both men opened fire. Jack felt hot, searing pain as his ears rang. His vision went white around the edges, making it difficult to see. The ringing asterisk, crack asterisk of gunfire filled the air. Suddenly, he was on the ground. He could hear screaming and smelled hot grease and metal, along with the smell of smoke and rotten eggs. There was something hot and wet on the ground around him. He couldn't move, couldn't think. He just wanted to go home.